Hello, this is Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Rochelle Harrison-Pless. Thanks for joining us. Coming up, the International Criminal Court gives the go-ahead to a full investigation into alleged crimes against humanity in Burundi. The presidency blasting the news by accusing the ICC of fraud and outrageous lies. Crops wiped out, livelihoods lost, hunger and desperation. We take a look at the effects of climate change in Uganda, a country hit hard by one of the worst droughts in decades. And a soft power push into Africa. China is now the second most popular destination for African students heading abroad, allowing Beijing to boost its influence on the continent. Good to have you with us. The International Criminal Court has given the green light to a full investigation into alleged crimes against humanity in Burundi. Judges said there are reasonable grounds to investigate cases of murder, rape and torture reportedly committed by both government and opposition groups. The country pulled out of the ICC last month. Despite this, the court says the probe will cover alleged crimes committed up until that time. Erin Ogunki reports.
The International Criminal Court has approved a request to open an investigation into crimes against humanity that may have been committed in Burundi. In a press statement issued on Thursday, the court said it would look into crimes committed by the Burundian government and government-linked groups against political opponents. The prosecutor has presented evidence of crimes against humanity in the country, including murder, torture, rape, and forced disappearances. The prosecutor can enlarge the scope of the investigation to include war crimes or genocide on the basis of any new evidence that may surface. The alleged crimes are said to have left more than 1,000 dead, thousands illegally detained and tortured, and close to 500,000 displaced over the past 2 years. Renewed violence in the country broke out in 2015, when President Pierre Nkurunziza announced that he would run for a third term, a decision the opposition deemed unconstitutional. The timing of the investigation announcement came just in time. ICC judges issued the authorization to investigate on October 25th, just 2 days before Burundi became the first country to successfully leave the court. The authorization proceedings had been conducted confidentially to protect victims and potential witnesses. But the country's withdrawal has little effect on the ICC's jurisdiction. According to Article 127 of the Rome Statute, the treaty that established the court, it can investigate crimes committed prior to a country's withdrawal. Burundi's leaders accuse the institution of bias against African nations. All but one of the 11 cases the court has investigated involve African countries.
Now, Burundi's presidency has hit back at news of the ICC investigation, accusing the court of, quote, outrageous lies to implement Western powers' hidden agenda to destabilize Africa. Well, for more on this story, I'm joined now by Juan Branco, a lawyer and author specialized in international criminal law, who works for the prosecutor of the ICC. Juan, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Now, Burundi's government, as you heard there, has slammed the investigation as a fraud. Would Burundi legally have to cooperate with the ICC, even though it quit?
Yes, it's a very complicated theme, but it seems clear that the Burundi will have an obligation to cooperate, since the decision was taken 2 days before the official withdrawal of Burundi from the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. So the court played a strange game in which it maintained secret its decision until today, from the 26th of October until today. We don't know yet why. We suppose it is for protection of victims and potential testimonies that will have to be brought outside Burundi. But so it created a kind of an uncertainty for a few hours about whether the decision was applicable and whether the Burundi would have to cooperate. But now it is clear that Burundi will have to cooperate with the International Criminal Court. On the other hand, there is no way to force Burundi to do anything, basically. It's a sovereign state, and even though it has a legal obligation, the court will face the same issue as it always faces. It will have no access to the country because the authorities will not accept this cooperation, and there will be no real way to sanction the authorities for such lack of cooperation.
Now, the ICC has been criticised for prosecuting only Africans so far and accused of deliberately targeting Africans. Do you think that's fair?
I think the criticism is interesting and fair, not only because it has willingly attacked African states or rebels inside those states. No, it's not because of question of racism, but more maybe because the International Criminal Court, which has no power, has to attack itself to the weakest players in the international game. So, and as such, the African states and the actors of the African conflicts are perceived as weak actors towards which the court can act more easily. So the trend might be changing now that a willingness to open an investigation in Afghanistan has happened, and maybe a tentative to trial or at least prosecute people coming from the CIA and who would have tortured a certain number of persons, of Afghan persons. But for now, the criticism still stands. And the fact that the ICC is not able to go further than attacking weak states or weak actors on the international arena and thus concentrating itself in Africa is receivable.
Okay. Well, other African countries have threatened to pull out of the ICC, blasting the court as corrupt and hijacked by the West. Could this probe then, involving Burundi, deter other countries from following in its footsteps, as in the ICC can still come after you even if you've quit?
Well, it could push them to withdraw as soon as possible, because actually the Burundi withdrew a year ago, and it had a year, and the court had a year starting that decision to open its investigation, because you need to have a delay of a year between the moment you decide to withdraw and the moment the withdrawal is effective. And so the court, 2 days before, the year delay, decided to open the investigation. So it could push, we could think that other countries could tell themselves, okay, we should withdraw starting now. I don't think it will happen. Burundi is a special case in which there is still today, I think, a pre-genocidal situation, and I don't think other states will identify themselves with the Burundi situation.
Okay, Juan, thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. Juan Branco, a lawyer and author specialised in international criminal law and who once worked for the prosecutor of the ICC. Thank you again for your time. Next, record numbers of protesters flooded the streets in towns and cities across Togo for a third day of anti-government rallies this week, piling the pressure on President Gnassingbé, whose family has ruled the country for half a century. Demonstrators are calling for his resignation and say they won't back down until he quits. An opposition coalition is demanding the introduction of a 2-term presidential limit and electoral reform. Now, Zimbabwe's main airport has been renamed after the country's president. Harare International Airport will now be known as Robert Gabriel Mugabe International Airport. There was much pomp and pageantry as the 93-year-old longtime leader attended the official renaming ceremony on Thursday. State media said the move was in recognition of President Mugabe's, quote, liberation and black empowerment efforts. The COP23 Global Climate Conference is in full swing in Germany, the first summit since the United States announced it was pulling out of the historic Paris Agreement. Many in Africa fear they'll be hit harder than most by rising temperatures. In Uganda, climate change has sparked one of the worst droughts in decades, with desperate locals struggling to survive after losing their livelihoods. Clément Bonneau has more.
These herders in Karamoja, northern Uganda, know the effects of climate change better than anyone. Years of erratic rainfall and rising temperatures have completely disrupted their way of life. Many go hungry for weeks and have to sell their cattle to make ends meet.
The seasons are different now. Sometimes we have rain, but it comes too late. For example, in January we planted some seeds. The crops grew, but by March they had died out.
Temperatures in East Africa are set to rise by 2.3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century if no measures are taken. According to projections by Uganda's Meteorological Authority, rainfall levels are also projected to increase, but it doesn't mean there'll be more water reserves in the region.
It means even if it is going to rain heavily during that time, but the temperature is very high, so it means that there will be too much evaporation.
The Ugandan government is now pushing for more sustainable agricultural practices, such as moving around animals to prevent overgrazing. Authorities also say more international aid is needed to build water reserves and improve water management.
Last year, there was very serious drought and hunger. And then we sat together with both the donors and asked government and the leaders of the districts, and we said, what is the problem? And actually we found the problem is water.
Last year, more than half of Karamoja's population, that's more than 600,000 people, faced food shortages, raising fears of a humanitarian crisis in the region.
And finally, Beijing is vying for global influence, especially in Africa. The Chinese scholarship program is part of a soft power strategy to attract African students, cultivating the continent's next generation of scholars and elites. The plan appears to be working so far. The number of Africans studying in China has skyrocketed in recent years.
A Tai Chi class for these African students, and a graceful introduction to Chinese culture here at the Beijing Business School. They come from Togo, Ivory Coast, South Sudan, and they've just arrived in China.
It's freezing here, and there are so many Chinese people. I'm not used to seeing such massive crowds.
Time now for their first Mandarin lesson. This year, 50,000 African students have received a scholarship from the Chinese government to study in China. That's 20 times as many as 10 years ago.
It wasn't actually difficult because if you look at the requirements they wanted, they were actually not so much. And unlike other institutions or other countries,
these two students have lived in China for over 2 years. Their course is all paid for by the government, as are flights, accommodation and food. They even get a monthly stipend of €450.
I'm amazed by what I've seen in China so far. It's a country that's investing in research and new technologies. What Chinese people are doing now, maybe we'll be able to do it in Africa one day.
For the Chinese government, providing education is a way of extending China's soft power, cultivating the next generation of African scholars and elites. The government also hopes that the experience these students get in China will translate into a willingness to work with Chinese companies in the future.
I know China better than any other foreign country. I've never been to Europe or the US, so maybe when I go back to Africa, I'll choose to work with China.
Due to Chinese visa rules, most international students cannot stay in China after their education is complete. Most return home, bringing their new skills with them.
That's it for now. I'll have more Africa news in around 45 minutes. Stay with us. Live from Paris continues with Mark Owen up next.
We have a new initiative at The Observers. The Observers Take Action. Ordinary people around the world who have concrete ideas and projects to make their part of the world a better place. It could be for the environment. It could be for education. Or to improve the society they live in. If you know of someone in your community who's working to make a difference, let us know.